It is a pleasure to introduce you to the Burton Book Review podcast, with interviews of America's leading authors by our nation's finest law professors and scholars. Each podcast is featured on the American Bar Association Journal and on theburtonbookreview.com. We are honored to be joined by Elie Honig on our inaugural episode of the show. Elie is the senior legal analyst for CNN and is joining us today to discuss his new book, When You Come at the King, Inside DOJ's Pursuit of the President from Nixon to Trump, which we had the pleasure of reviewing for the Burton Book Review a few weeks ago. And now, to our program.
Hi, Elie. Welcome to the podcast. I'm thrilled to have you here. It was wonderful reading your book. We're talking about When You Come at the King, Inside DOJ's Pursuit of the President from Nixon to Trump. For anybody watching, this is the...
Wait, I have mine too. There we go.
Oh, good. We have our twin copies of the book. So I wanted to just before getting into the content, I wanted to just zoom out and start with a broad question, which is, how did you become an author? Because I know you started as a prosecutor and are a CNN legal analyst, but what made you decide you wanted to write books?
Well, everything the last 8 years since I finished being a prosecutor has been an accident. I'll say it candidly. None of this was ever a plan. I never took a journalism class. I never had some aspiration to go to law school and then turn that into something in media. I was, as I joke sometimes when I speak at these groups, I say I was a real lawyer once. And now I'm some sort of hybrid. But I mean, journalism media is the predominant thing that I do now. It started, when I say by accident, it's because when I came out of the AG's office was the year 2018, the summer. And the Robert Mueller investigation, which I write about in the book, was in full swing. And I had friends who were starting to appear in media. And they said, look, every day someone's getting subpoenaed or indicted or pleading out or cooperating. And they just need prosecutors who can explain this stuff. And so I started doing it and I enjoyed it and signed with CNN. The book thing, I'll just tell you a little bit of behind the scenes with books. You know, I had been doing CNN maybe 2 or 3 years. I had played around with the idea of shopping a book. I actually briefly had a book agent through my talent agency. And we got a couple nibbles, but nothing really came of it. And then one day in the summer of 2020 during COVID, I got a DM. Like, you know, we get crazy DMs all day long from sometimes fans and sometimes people who are not fans and who knows. And it was just from Eric Nelson, who's an editor at HarperCollins. And it's 17 words. I don't exactly remember it, but I counted. And it says, I still have it somewhere. And I quoted it in one of my acknowledgments. It just says basically, I see you on air. Would you be interested in writing a book about DOJ and Bill Barr? P.S. This is an editor, not not an agent. And that's it. And we did 3 books in the next 5 years together. Same team, same publisher, same editor, and it works well.
No, that's great. Exactly. I'm an editor. I'm not a bot. This is for real.
Yes.
That's a great story that you. And so, because I was going to ask actually, sort of my next question is your previous books that you started with Bill Barr, and the DOJ, and I guess what inspired you to write this particular book?
So this is my third. So my first one was about Bill Barr and DOJ. It was a Look, I would say the one through line of all 3 of my books is, in a phrase, DOJ's independence. Mm-hmm. And the Barr book, that's what HarperCollins came to me with, because I'd been on air, been critical of Bill Barr, of many of the things he was doing. Although, as I sort of argue in the new book, what Pam Bondi is doing is entirely different even from Bill Barr. So the middle book was about, it's called Untouchable, How Powerful People Get Away with It. So I would say the core theses of the 3 books boil down. Number one is Bill Barr is politicizing DOJ in what I would now call a defensive manner, meaning to protect Donald Trump and other people around him. The middle book, I would say, if I had to boil it down, was everyone's telling you that Donald Trump is going to end up in prison. This was in 2022 when he hadn't yet been indicted, but we knew he would be. Everyone is telling you that Donald Trump's final nail in the coffin, walls are closing in, he's going to prison. It's not going to be as easy as you're being told. Here's why the odds are stacked against that. That proved to be correct. And now the new one is really more of a history going back to Watergate through the Jack Smith investigations. And that's a little more complex. But with respect to the state of DOJ, I argue at the end that what we're seeing now under the Pam Bondi DOJ is more extreme substantially even than Bill Barr, because not only is Pam Bondi using DOJ defensively to protect favored people, but offensively to go after disfavored people, which has something to do with the title of this book as well.
Well, actually, the perfect segue, because I was going to ask that that you drew from the landmark HBO series The Wire. The title is excellent. My students all know one of the hallmarks of my teaching is actually blending pop culture with the law. Did the title come to you immediately, or were you casting about for one for a bit, or did you have a different? And if you had others, did you have a different theory of the case or a discarded title?
So the latter, we did not have this title in the beginning. I don't think I had a title for any of the three. Well, I think I had Untouchable when I started, but Bill Barr. I mean, I'll give you a little again. Like if people are interested in the book process, we knew what the Bill Barr book would be, but I wanted to call it. At some point, Eric called me and said, "So what do you want for a title?" And I said, I was thinking Injustice. Super clever, right? And he goes, he's a very blunt guy. He just says, "Nah, that's boring. I don't like books that are just titled with vague thing. Sounds like a Jim Comey book, right? Higher truth, better justice, blah blah blah." Comey, by the way, gets criticized quite severely.
Another of the villains of the book.
Yeah. So this book, actually, I will tell you, I remember the initial idea was we were going to call it either Painting the Bullseye or Drawing the Bullseye. Because there's the old aphorism about it's meant to be a criticism of prosecutors, where there's an archer and he shoots a bunch of arrows into the woods and they all hit trees, but they're all in the middle of the bullseyes. And someone says to him, "How did you get all bullseyes?" He goes, "Easy, shoot the arrows first and then paint the bullseye around them." So, but I thought that was a little obscure and it didn't hit hard. When You Come at the King, yes, is drawn. I drew it from Omar in The Wire, although as my research revealed, it goes back hundreds of years to Machiavelli and before that. But I did have a moment when my worry was, I like the vividness of it. I like the applicability of it. My worry was people might not immediately understand what that means. But I think they did. And I had a moment that put me over the top when I was it was coalescing in my head. Eric liked it, but I said, let me just sit on it for a minute. And I came in, I was on CNN that night and I ran it by two people. One of them is maybe 45 years old, black man. And the other is like 60 years old, a white woman. And both of them said, "Oh, that's it. You got to go with it." And I said, okay, they both loved it. And I said, all right, that's a pretty good range right there. So, yeah. And for those who don't know, it's Omar says, "When you come at the king, you best not miss," which is an evolution of a Machiavellian and Emersonian theory. Which is fairly self-explanatory.
Yeah, and I think it actually probably it resonates even more now, particularly in light of the No King rallies and other things. I think it has even just it's aged particularly well. So
yeah, that part was, and honestly, the whole No Kings thing came up after we had already named it and printed it. So I guess that was fortunate. Yeah,
you're prescient. What was this is now sort of getting back into I mean, we've talked about the process of developing the title. What is your research and writing process?
So this book lent itself beautifully to a structure. And I will tell you, I've said this before, this structure occurred to me. You can say I took it from George Stephanopoulos, who of course was, a high-ranking advisor in the Clinton White House. He did a book a little bit before mine called The Situation Room. And I read it and it was great. And he takes the White House Situation Room and he tells episodically, each time, not every time, but the major times they've used the Situation Room, from Cuban Missile Crisis through 9/11 through COVID. And he sort of goes inside and he talks to people who were there, people who were part of those administrations. And at some point, as I was reading it, or maybe shortly after, I thought, ooh, that would work really well with all these major presidential or president adjacent prosecutions and investigations. And so once I had that structure, it immediately worked. Everyone immediately liked it that I ran it by, including my publisher. What was unexpected here was I thought I'd be able to get some insight from maybe a handful of people here or there. I know some of the people who were involved. I thought I might be able to parlay one person into another and maybe have maybe one voice per chapter every other chapter. I ended up with 36 or 37 people on record in this book who were involved in these cases. And everybody's on record. Everybody's on name. Nobody's anonymous. I had a couple of people who wanted to go anonymous. I said, not going to do it. If you want to talk, if you don't want to talk, that's fine. If you do, we're going to use your name. I don't have any problem with anonymous sources. I just didn't want to do it in this book. And I got as you know from having read the book, and you can probably tell my favorite part of this is just the insider stories, the human stories that are part of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love exactly as I called them in my review, the prosecutorial play-by-plays.
Yeah.
And I also thought that the structure was excellent, just very clear. Each chapter
Thank
is
you.
self-contained, building
Yeah.
chronologically, and I also just like that you sort of feel the sense of the rhythm of the fever pitch as we reach the modern era, especially with sort of the rash of annual special counsel appointments
Right.
culminating in Jack Smith. I mean, now I guess we have a respite. It might be a generous term.
Yeah.
This is sort of more of a technical question, but what do you write? What do you write on? Because I know some people are old-fashioned and are like, "I love my yellow legal pads," and others write on tablets, and others, or
So
yeah.
yeah, the answer for me is Google Docs. And although I will say, I have what the way I do it is I love Google Docs. I think it works really well because I can access it from anywhere. If I'm even just like at the gym and I say, "Ooh, here's a quick idea," I can just pull up the Google Doc and just I won't write there, but I can just go add part about blah blah blah. So it's accessible from anywhere. But the problem is Google Docs then get heavy when you put too much into them and too many links. So I do one chapter for each Google Doc. Then I ultimately merge them together into one big Word doc. Now, I will say there are great programs out there, software for book writing. A good friend of mine who wrote a book showed me one, and it looked marvelous. But I also knew that I would screw it up. I would never remember. I mean, I'm sort of low tech. I mean, I'll give you another example. Like Google Docs is very secure, but I was always terrified that somehow it would just delete everything. And so at the end of every writing day, I would copy the entire document, paste it into an email, and then email it to myself at two different email addresses that I have, just in case everything got sort of deleted or wiped out or someone hacked my Google or something like that. So I'm not very sophisticated, but I've done it now 3 times and it works.
Yeah, no, you have to have your whatever your process is. It's idiosyncratic. I also love that you're backing everything up.
Oh,
To all the
yes.
students that are listening out there, you need to back everything up and make sure
Yeah.
everything's saved in multiple places.
Yeah, no, that's the modern equivalent of dog ate my homework, got wiped out or someone deleted it or I got hacked. Yeah, you can't allow that. I mean, with a book too, it's like you put, a year of your life into it. You can't risk that.
Absolutely. I was going to say, so apropos of a year, you mentioned that you've cranked out, and I mean, you cranked out into using that verb intentionally. Three
Yep.
books in three, or I'm sorry, 3 books in
5 years.
5 years is quite a brisk pace.
Yeah.
I was gonna, do you, I mean, of course, you have other jobs and other things. Do you carve out space? Is it just that it's consistently occurring? I mean, I was going to say, how is your kind of time management process for this? And it sounds like you're a very fast writer.
I am a fast writer. I'm a relentless editor, self-editor. So even what I write every week for New York Magazine, the main thing for me is just get it all out there on paper and then craft, craft, craft. I mean, it's a luxury that we don't often have as lawyers.
Yeah.
You do have the luxury of editing, but when you're a trial lawyer, trust me, there's a lot of my jury addresses. I wish I could go back and move this part up and delete this part. You don't always have that in media, on live TV. We certainly don't have that luxury, but when you're writing something, a book or an article, you usually have almost limitless editing opportunity. What I do is I'm very disciplined and I torture myself in that when I'm in the heavy writing phase, I absolutely have to write about at least 500 words a day, no matter what. Even if it's 500 words I'm not going to use, even if it's 500 words is going to get chipped down to 50. And you just have to do that relentlessly. The other thing is, I tell people if you're thinking of writing a book, definitely do it, but definitely do not do it until you have a topic that lights you up, because you will live with this for a year.
Mm-hmm.
And if you end up with a drag of a topic or a topic that's disappointing or you're forcing yourself into, it's going to be miserable for you. The other thing that was different about this book is I had so many first-person interviews that a lot of the times the chapters somewhat wrote themselves. I mean, I went into this book trying to take the mindset of a juror. Like I went into the first book saying, I'm criticizing Bill Barr. I went into the second book saying, I'm disabusing people of the notion that Donald Trump's somehow going to, die in jail. This one, I said, well, let me explore each of these cases, and I'll draw judgments, which I do at the end of each chapter. But I didn't have a preset idea of this one was good, this one was bad. And from talking to people, as you see in the book, sometimes they interplay with each other. Sometimes they disagree. Sometimes they contradict. Sometimes they agree. So I spent more time in this last one doing interviews, sometimes several hours long, and then, working off of that to sort of structure the chapter.
Okay. And while you were doing the interviews, would you then interview people and then write up the chapter, or at least put it into, or as you were organizing your notes, it kind of coalesced into a chapter? So you were both interviewing and writing
Yeah.
at the same time, as opposed to doing 95% of the research and interviewing and then sitting down to write your 500 plus words a day.
It was a constant intermingling. I mean, in order to prep for some of these cases, I know better than others, right? Some of these cases I've covered with CNN, and so I already know them pretty darn well. But, Iran Contra, I was 12 when that was happening. Like, I remember Oliver North standing up, and that's about it. So, in order to prep for those interviews, I would have to get, okay, what are the basic timelines? Who did they do what? Who are the key players? And then talking to the people brought it to life, and I would just sort of weave the quotes in, and then, it sort of, it all like flowed together like that.
So you mentioned that you approached it like a juror, which I think is great, sort of having an open mind. Were there any interviews or accounts of an investigation that surprised you or changed your initial view or impression?
So two I'm going to mention. One of my favorite interviews that I do in the book is with Saul Weisenberg. Saul Weisenberg was basically the number 2 guy to Ken Starr in the Clinton investigations. Now, this was happening in the late 90s when I was in law school, so I remember it quite clearly. Ken Starr, by the way, passed away in, I think, 2022, so obviously. But Weisenberg had been a federal prosecutor like I was, and he was the real prosecutor on Clinton's team. He's the guy who asked Bill Clinton the question that Bill Clinton answered with, "It depends on what the meaning of is." Mm-hmm. Now, Saul was great because he was so candid. He believes in what they did. He's not one of these people who now, 30 years later, badmouths the team and says they were out of control, but he's also candid. He admitted to me a couple things that have never been cleanly admitted before. One, that Ken Starr's team leaked to the media, which was long a point of contention. I talked to Clinton's legal team, too, several members. They're still ticked off to this day. And I asked Saul, I said, I got to ask you straight up, did you guys leak or not? And he said, oh, yeah. He goes, it was these 2 guys, and it pissed me off because it was undermining us. The other thing Saul did admit is that in the Starr report, which, of course, was controversial because it had so much graphic sexual detail, that there were moments where they included stuff in there that was too far, that was not necessary, and that he wasn't like bawling, crying an apology, but he said, yeah, looking back, that's probably fair. So that was one that I found really interesting and enlightening and surprising. The other thing that surprised me was, and again, this is much more recent, but just how far over the line Jack Smith was in a lot of the things he did in pursuing Donald Trump. Now, I don't think Jack Smith was corrupt. I don't think Jack Smith had bad motives, but the way that one lawyer who, Abby Lowell, a famous Democrat, put it to me is, who had earlier cases with Jack Smith, he said, I love Jack Smith, I think the world of him, but the guy's a heat-seeking missile. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of things in Jack Smith's past that show that he is a habitual prosecutorial overcharger and abuser of prosecutorial power. And when I really dug in, there were a lot of things he did in the Trump cases that were sort of just blindly applauded by people in the media that were really inappropriate, unconstitutional, arguably, and I think undermined him.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on that in a little bit, because I want to finish talking about a little bit about the process, and then I'm going to get into more about the books and the interviews. Did you have was there a white whale interviewee, somebody that you wanted to talk to? I was going to say, I don't know if it's Jim Comey, but
that's a great question. So,
or someone you would have liked to that declined, or someone who just didn't respond, or it could even be a Ken Starr. He's not around anymore. I feel like this is a college essay of who you'd like to have dinner with.
I'm going to separate this into dead people and living people. How about that? First of all, there were way more people who went the opposite way, who I was shocked spoke to me, who I didn't know, who I reached out to cold. I mean, Rod Rosenstein, a very important figure in the book. I never met him. I just emailed him at his law firm, and he said, absolutely. David Kendall, who represented Bill Clinton, to this day represents Bill Clinton. Absolutely. He had me down. I went down and visited him at his firm. We spent hours together. He took me to lunch. Wonderful guy. So I got, Judy Miller, by the way, is one of my favorites. She's the New York Times reporter who got locked up. I can't say who, but somebody at CNN gave me her email and said, she's kind of reclusive, and don't be upset if she's a little terse and just sort of tells you to bug off. And I emailed her, and she said, absolutely, I know who you are. I think you're a fair player. And she gave me several hours. So that's okay. Now, to your question, the people who declined to speak with me, who I really wanted to speak with, Jim Comey, absolutely, because I'm very critical of him in the book. I worked at SDNY, but I missed him by a few months. Like,
Okay.
he left in December, and I started there in April. So I don't know. I've met him here and there. But Jim Comey declined. Jack Smith declined. I really would have liked to speak with Jack Smith. He didn't want to. I mean, I wanted, and these are all people who come in for criticism, not unconditional, but generally come in for criticism. That's who I'm more interested in talking to. And so if I could go into deceased people, certainly Ken Starr. But I'll tell you, I would love to have a chance to talk to would have been some of the Watergate prosecutors, Elliot Richardson, long deceased, Archibald Cox, because I think they're heroes. I was lucky enough to talk to two people who were young members of the Watergate, Jill Wine-Banks and Jim Quarles. They were 30 and 26 at the time. Now they're in their early 80s, late 70s, and they were some of my favorite interviews in the book. But yeah, to have a chance to speak with Archibald Cox or somebody like that would have been remarkable.
Yeah, no, I think that, and interesting to hear who you would have liked to have spoken to if they were available, but also who chose not to go on the record as well.
Yeah, Jim Comey's response was through an intermediary, a mutual friend, was something like, well, he's kind of trying to keep a low profile. Oh, sure. Yeah. Jim Comey's so media shy. Andrew Weissman, who I know, I've had dinners with him and stuff, declined on the BS excuse that I can't talk about. He wrote a book. I said, I read your book, Andrew, about his experience with Mueller. And I said, I'd love to talk. Great job on the book. I'd love to interview you for my book. And he sort of gave me the runaround. And he said, I'm not allowed because I already went through pre-clearance on my book, meaning you have to send your book into DOJ. But the guy's done dozens upon dozens of public speeches and interviews about his book. So he dodged me as well.
Okay. Interesting. What would you say it was the most challenging aspect of writing the book?
So you touch on this in the book review you did of the book, which I read, which I thought was very well done. If I can give your book criticism a criticism, I think it was very well done. Okay. Book review, I should say. I did not want people to be scared off and to think that this was for lawyers only, and I didn't want it to read that way. I wanted it to read like a true crime type book, which is Scott Turow reviewed my second book. I didn't know he was doing it, the famous true crime or fiction crime writer, and he said something like, it reads like true crime even though it reads like fiction crime even though it's real crime, something like that. So the key though that I used, so first of all, I try to not get too deep into the legalese unless sometimes it's necessary to just explain why something happened. But I always try to explain it to a lay audience. Mm-hmm. And there's another thing that my editor told me from the first book, which I think is great advice to anyone writing a book. He said, the parts of the book that are the most fun for you to research and write are going to be the parts that are the most fun to read, and vice versa. The parts that feel like homework for you and teeth pulling are going to be miserable to read. And I'll give you one example of that. In talking about Ken Starr and Bill Clinton, I originally just slogged my way through and wrote up what ended up being a 5-page or so bit about explaining what whitewater was. And I just thought, oh, it's so dense and it's so complicated. And you know what? I just said, you know what? I don't need this. And if you look at the book, it's 2 sentences. It's basically like Ken Starr began by investigating whitewater, which was a complex interlocked series of bank loans and land deals in Arkansas. Mm-hmm. Then, that's it. Like that one sentence. So you do have that ability and luxury to cut, as I've said to friends of mine who've written books, you're not writing a statement of facts for a Second Circuit brief here. You're writing something that I wanted normal people to be able to understand, to be entertained by.
Yeah, no, and I think you do that really, really well, which is you have to provide enough context so that people can understand the details, but you don't have to provide, I say lawyers are always uselessly accurate. And that's a term that I use with my students, is just every single fact, every single detail, as opposed to being much more selective.
Very good advice. And by the way, I love the anecdotes that have nothing to do with the law. I mean, you can tell, that you allude to one in the review, how Judy Miller told me how to make prison lipstick, I should say. I'm not giving that away. You have to read the book if you want to know. There's another one that I love where the aforementioned Archibald Cox, who was the Watergate special prosecutor, who was this sort of starched patrician figure who wore a bow tie, and he had been a Harvard law professor, and they all worshipped him. And I forget if it was Quarles or Jill Wine-Banks, but one of the people who was then a young prosecutor said, where our office was in D.C., across the street was a place called Archibald's. And it's still there, actually. And they said one day, Archie Cox said, we should all go and have a group lunch at Archibald's. And they had to tell him, yeah, Archie, that's actually a strip club. It's not for you. So, I do love those kind of stories, even if they're, not legally relevant.
No, but they highlight and they make everyone human.
Yes, I want these people to read as characters, exactly, which they are.
Exactly. They are.
Yep.
They are for history too. Well, we've been talking about both process, but also, and as well as the substance of your book, but sort of more specifically,
Yep.
why I was going to say. So the through line of all of your books, as you said, is DOJ's independence. I suppose that's possibly the answer to this, but just for those who have not read the book,
Yep.
in a nutshell, why do we need a special counsel?
Because some investigations are so pressurized politically and in terms of media coverage and public attention, and so high stakes that we need that extra level of independence and separation. We need to be able to look at a case and say, do we trust that the fix was not in on this case from the start? Now, we've achieved that. I'm not saying, by the way, and I argue in the book, there is no perfect system. You can criticize any of the various systems that we've had. You can certainly criticize the system I suggest at the end. But we want to be able to look at a case and say, do I believe that that was a truly good faith investigation? And so the idea is, let's take it out one degree of separation from the attorney general, who is typically or always appointed by the president.
Mm-hmm.
And also we want a person of a certain caliber, a certain background, a certain bipartisan or nonpartisan background, a certain depth of experience. Robert Mueller, to me, is sort of a platonic example of that, a guy who neither side could credibly say was a partisan either way, had done all the big jobs at DOJ and in the military. And you can certainly quibble with his ultimate result, and
Yes.
I talk about that in the book, but you can't quibble with the person.
No, for sure. I was going to say, and I feel like he's probably from a bygone era at this point. Sadly.
Yeah. Well, one of the facts I dug up in researching the book is he is, I'm sure, the only person in U.S. history to be nominated to presidentially, advice and consent positions by 4 consecutive presidents, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and was confirmed unanimously by the Senate every time. We will never have that again.
Oh
I
no,
promise.
we will
No.
never forget the nominated by both parties, let alone the unanimous vote. On none of those metrics will we ever have one again.
Exactly.
So you mentioned earlier that basically, when talking about Jack Smith, you described it as a heat-seeking missile issue, or also that he just sort of went sort of far to the outer limits. And perhaps we kind of alluded as well to maybe Ken Starr treating, going beyond his remit. I mean, is the issue just inherent in being a special counsel that you're appointed with an objective, so you lock in on a target and pursue them at all costs? I mean, is that just sort of baked into being a special counsel, or do you think that there are some criteria or some rules or anything we can develop to prevent this phenomenon?
Well, so the perception of that is definitely baked in, right? Anytime you have, name your person, Jack Smith, you're appointed to investigate this person, Donald Trump, on 2 different things, as it turned out with Jackson. Name your Ken Starr, Bill Clinton, go. Robert Hur, Joe Biden, go. And even if it's not true, even if it's not what the person does, or it's debatable, it's going to look that way. This has to do with one of my proposals at the end of the book. I propose a more permanent office, so you eliminate that sort of 1 versus 1, one prosecutor versus 1 target, at least appearance. It's interesting, I've never thought about this, but sort of comparing and contrasting Ken Starr and Jack Smith, I think Ken Starr comes off as probably the worst of all of these special counsels in the book, and I think the record's mixed on Jack Smith, but they kind of had the opposite problem. Ken Starr dragged his case out for so many years, just waiting and hoping. Mm-hmm. And there's this moment when people may or may not remember this, but Watergate, the aforementioned real estate deals, Ken Starr was looking at that for 3 or 4 years and wasn't getting anywhere near the Clintons. And Clinton's team in the book says to me, this guy was just hanging on, hoping for something, and all of a sudden Monica Lewinsky falls. So, but I think Lanny Brewer, who's one of the White House lawyers at the time, said, all of a sudden he gets this manna from heaven. Mm-hmm. Ken Starr's lawyer, Saul Weisenberg, told me I was on a detail to Ken Starr's team that was supposed to expire in February of 98. But in January of 98, Monica happened, and I thought, ooh, now I'm going to stick around. Now I'm going to extend this. So he ends up drawing this out and going way outside. He initially only had that that Whitewater lane, and then he asked for permission to expand it to Monica, and it goes crazy and all that. Jack Smith, on the other hand, the first line of the Jack Smith chapter is Jack Smith never had a chance.
Right.
And I argue that by the time Merrick Garland finally let 2 years come off the clock and appoints Jack Smith in November of 2022, there was never any, and this is the theme of my prior book, there was never any practical way he was going to be able to investigate, indict, get through the obvious looming immunity issue, and then try before the 2024 election. And I think in part because of that time pressure and that no-win position Jack Smith was put in, he went over the top at times to try to beat that clock in ways that you would never do if not for the fact that your defendant's Donald Trump and there's an election coming up. I mean, just as one example, Jack Smith was furiously demanding a trial date 4.5 months after the indictment on the January 6th case. That's where any defense lawyer in this country will tell you that's impossible. You can't go through 13 million pages of documents as a defense lawyer in 4 months and prepare a defense. So I think they almost had one was stretched out too long, one was too compressed, and they both sort of overcompensated.
Yeah, it's an interesting clock. One was running out the clock, and yeah, exactly. One was running out the clock, and one was running against the clock, and in different ways, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
So also, I actually want to go back sort of in time too, because
Sure.
this sort of is intriguing me before all of the modern eras, and we'll get to that a little bit more too, which is, right, the concept of an outsider coming in to investigate executive branch wrongdoing actually goes all the way back to, you couldn't talk to him, but Ulysses S. Grant, as you point out. But that this is really actually the sort of deeply embedded in our history, and that this, even though it is just now become an annual phenomenon, it's something that has been part of our history for centuries at this point. This was just sort of something that I thought of since the current Supreme Court really adheres to, and I'll say has an affection for history and tradition. Is this a worthwhile avenue of argumentation to perhaps preserve and legitimize the special counsel system? Just another way of thinking about it, because,
right.
It's come under attack from such quarters as, Justice Thomas and Eileen Cannon.
Well, it's always, the special counsel is always subject to policy criticisms and legal criticisms. It's been the institution itself. We've been through various statutory and regulatory iterations, but has wound up at the Supreme Court twice, really, in the Watergate era and then in the Morrison case in 1988. The current one, Eileen Cannon said, is unconstitutional, but we never got a full answer because, of course, Trump won the election and threw out everything. So, but I love the deep history because it reminds us of a couple things. It reminds us that we've always understood, going back to the 1870s, that when you get a case that's that close to the president, you just need some sort of outsider to do it. You can't hand it to the president's own AG, because even if that AG is going to do a good job, it's not going to look like it. People are not going to accept it. And I love the Ulysses Grant story in particular for a couple reasons. One, I've heard people say, I don't want to say who, but a very expert person who appears in this book did a podcast about the history of special counsel and very confidently announced that the first ever outside prosecutor was in the Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s. And that's sort of like one of these false things that may say that on Wikipedia or something. It's just wrong. The first one ever was Ulysses S. Grant in 1870. I also love the fact that the scandal is so very 1870s-ish. It was basically these tax collectors collecting whiskey tax from the St. Louis region who were paying kickbacks and graft around the whiskey rebellion, or not the whiskey rebellion, but the whiskey tax. But the main reason I like the Ulysses S. Grant story is a lot of the beats are the exact same that we see repeated over the next 150 years. He brings in an outsider. The outsider starts getting people closer and closer to the president's inner circle. The president then tries to undermine him. Mm-hmm. Then Grant comes up with a pretext to try to fire him. But there's political pressure and it backfires. And then the guy indicts someone really close to the president. And then the president fires him. And it's just like, Grant complains that the media is being unfair to him. And the media complains that Grant's not being forthcoming. You could change the name and nobody's quite doing what Donald Trump has done. But it sounds not dissimilar from basically any other president to follow, I guess, with the exception of Trump, who has taken things to a whole new level.
Yeah, well, it's like how people say history never repeats, but it rhymes.
Rhymes, yeah, so, exactly.
Yeah, yep. It's definitely in terms of everything that we have back there.
Yeah.
Actually, so you mentioned this in terms of the getting closer to the council. I mean, what do you think? Elaborate a little bit on the role of the pardon power in the special counsel investigations. I mean, it seems like at least what has happened here is that it's. I mean, the pardon power seems particularly problematic because it undermines and even undoes much of the work of the special counsel investigations. That it seems like it's really
Yep.
just almost this veto at the end of the investigation. Is there anything we can do to safeguard the institution a little bit more?
That's something that took me by surprise because obviously I know about Trump's recent pardons of Manafort and Stone and all those guys. But when you look back chapter after chapter, I mean, virtually every person who ever got convicted by a special counsel, I mean, pretty close to all of them were pardoned or commuted. I don't think there's anything that can be done about that unless we're going to amend the Constitution and amend the pardon power, because the way the pardon power exists is unfettered. There's no limitation on it. I don't think it's realistic to suggest that somehow certain types of cases can or should be immune from the pardon power. But I mean, we know about Trump's pardons. I mean, Joe Biden pardoned Hunter Biden, so that that's a president pardoned his own son who was subject to one of these investigations, who was convicted under one of these investigations, an investigation that I think was deeply flawed, but the result was two convictions actually of Hunter Biden. If you Scooter Libby, who I have a chapter in there, Libby was commuted by George W. Bush and then pardoned by Trump. It's interesting too because the prosecutor on that case who I talked to said, the commutation of a sentence didn't bother me because I thought the sentence was actually probably a 3-year sentence, probably more than Libby needed. The pardon by Trump later did bother me because that was just to stick a finger in our eye, basically. That was just to be difficult. Bill Clinton pardoned a bunch of people around Whitewater. Bush and Reagan pardoned people around Iran-Contra. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason for that is really, it's the most simple explanation, which is, when you have special counsel investigations, they are inherently going to focus on people very close to or with access to the president. Right. Those are the people more likely to get pardons from presidents. So it is. I actually at one point was going to sort of almost worked up. I maybe somewhere I have a chart where I just listed out everyone who'd ever been convicted in one of these cases, and then how many of them have been pardoned or commuted, and it's well over half, maybe over 3/4.
Yeah. Oh, interesting that you actually tallied that up, because it did. It struck me that way, which is just like, once you start sniffing around the president, anybody that is in the inner circle is going to perhaps later or immediately get pardon commuted.
Yeah, and some of these pardons, I should say, were in my view justified because some of these prosecutors went overboard, or sometimes one of the dilemmas that comes up is, what do you do when you find a collateral crime that somebody has committed, right? And having nothing to do with the actual initial remit. And some have prosecuted them and some haven't, and some have sort of referred them out to U.S. attorneys' offices. So some of the pardons I think were fair. Others I think were just outrageous, just protecting political cronies.
Yeah. So I know, sort of getting to kind of the end of your book, really that whoever 48th president is going to inherit, one can hope, one will inherit a world without guardrails and norms, and that really the special counsel institution, we shouldn't just decimate it. It really is it's an essential element of our system. It's something that's worth preserving, but improving. And interestingly, you note that that it's something that we tend to revamp every quarter of a century. So we're actually overdue.
It's time, yeah.
We're a little bit behind schedule. You mentioned before perhaps having an independent commission or special counsel that transcends presidencies, really. But if you can highlight, I know you have several of them, but perhaps you can highlight one or two proposals for salvaging the system.
So this was sort of the twist, I guess, twist ending, at least from my perspective, of this book, which is, when I started writing this book, when we worked out the book contract and everything, was mid-2024. And we didn't know what the heck was going to happen with Donald Trump. There were 4 pending indictments of Donald Trump. I mean, if he had lost the election, we might be in a Jack Smith Trump trial right now, as we sit here probably would have been in early 2026. And so we didn't know, were we going to have to end this book on just sort of to be continued? We might have even postponed it. I don't know. But when Trump won, it gave us whether anyone likes that result or not, it definitely gave us a hard ending to this book, right?
Finale.
Where he shuts down all the investigations. And the twist is that what we are seeing now in Trump 2.0, I argue in the book, is a fundamental break in the chain of history, a break of everything we've seen from Watergate to Iran-Contra to Clinton to all the smaller 90s investigations that have sort of been forgotten, all the way on through to now. And I include Trump 1.0 in that because, what I say in the book is every president up until now, including Trump 1.0, nobody likes these. What president likes it when you have Pat Fitzgerald snooping around the White House and looking at, Scooter Libby, when you have, name your Iran-Contra scandal, right? Like, no president likes that. And to varying extents, our presidents have either undermined publicly or subtly or obstructed, running the gamut from Nixon and Trump on the one end, sort of obstructing and undermining, to, subtle commentary done by emissaries in the Clinton case. He himself didn't do it, but he would have other people do it.
Or even Ulysses S. Grant, apparently, as well.
Yeah, Ulysses S. Grant basically claimed he was the victim of a witch hunt, essentially. But when Trump 2.0 came in, they made clear two things. One, there will be nothing. There would not be another Robert Mueller. There will be nobody looking at, certainly not Donald Trump, but not even anyone anywhere around him. And second of all, we're going to weaponize now. We are going to come after Jim Comey and Letitia James and Mark Kelly and everybody else. And as much as I'm critical of Jim Comey, critical of Jack Smith to different extents, and I've been critical of Letitia James in public, I think the indictments and the investigations of all of them are outrageous and even more destructive. So what I do at the end is I do propose a new system. It's not perfect, but basically the structure of it would be, and this is pulled on, I asked a lot of the people I interviewed, what did you find about the system you operate in that was effective, that was ineffective, that helped you, that harmed you? And I would like to see, if I was, ruler of the universe, a semi-permanent position with a 5-year run, so it wouldn't be concomitant with any one presidency. It would overlap, sort of like the FBI director is supposed to be with the 10-year run, although we see Trump now just firing whoever he wants, ideally with presidential nomination and Senate confirmation, the same way your other top DOJ brass, whether it's the deputy AG, the solicitor general, with a semi-permanent office. So to avoid what we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Prosecutor A, your target is politician B. Instead, they might have 2 or 3 or 4 cases at once. They might have none. I don't know I don't have a great answer for what they do when they have none. I guess they can go and play solitaire or something. With an established staff of people who've been vetted for overt signs of political bias. I say in the book, you can never ask someone, you never should ask someone what your political views are. But I think in these scenarios, it's really damaging where you have people who have made public donations or public statements of support or criticism for one side or the other. That undermined a lot of what Mueller did. Several of his team members were overtly partisan. And as much as they say, well, but that didn't guide us, tell it to the other side. I mean, they're not going to believe that. Right. So I think we need to have somebody that's a little more permanent and a little more insulated, and that presidential nomination, Senate confirmation to A, give it political legitimacy, and B, to withstand the inevitable constitutional challenge that will come.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with you on the political bias and but treating it instead of like, well, what is it? Because it's so nebulous if you just say it's political bias, but just actual evidence of it, right? Statements or contributions.
Yeah,
that
two things.
Proving
public statements and political contribution. You don't have to say who'd you vote for, what do you feel. No. But look, you had people. Again, I'll give you an example. On Mueller's team, you had Andrew Weissman, who's very partisan, hyper partisan, supported Hillary Clinton, was at her 2016, what was supposed to be the victory party, but ended up not being a victory. Has donated to Democrats, and Andrew has said publicly, defending himself. Look, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, there's no secret I'm not like a huge Trump fan, but you can't look at anything I did in that case and say, well, he did something inappropriate because of his partisan biases. To which I say that's actually wrong, because there's 3 members of the team who say we had to stop him several times from doing things that would have been inappropriate. We caught him in the act of doing one thing and had to stop him from doing it. So he would have gone, and even if he did, even if he's right that he never did anything over the line or wanted to do anything over the line because of his political inclinations. The analogy I use in the book is, imagine it's the World Series and it's Game 7 and it's Yankees against Dodgers. I think that was who was in the World Series at the time. And the umpire had an Instagram account where he was wearing a Dodgers hat every day, just at the beach and holding a Dodgers pennant. And then he called a pretty good game in Game 7, and you can't necessarily point to any one call he got wrong. Should we expect Yankees fans to accept that? Of course not.
No, it's
so,
so much of it's public confidence and it's the
Right.
perception of legitimacy,
Right.
which are
Exactly.
just as important, if perhaps not more important, than the actual legitimacy of the
Yeah.
organization.
Matters a lot. Yes.
So you mentioned before with the star, the meandering star report, the salacious details. I know you've talked about too about the reports sort of becoming that we need to have a reporting requirement, but they've become out of control and they've turned into effectively novellas. I mean, I remember
Yeah.
the Star Report was actually people could buy the Star Report or get
Huge
copies of it.
bestseller. Yep.
I mean, do you have any suggestions or putting in some new guidelines to create just certain, I don't know, to limit them in some way or revise them?
And I had fun with this chapter because I distinctly remember the Star Report trying to download it in the early days of the internet, and it crashed and I couldn't get it. And I did some research on that and found, like, at the time it was covered in the media as the first test of the nascent internet, because it was the first online holy crap event. And I did have a thing in there that really made me feel old, because I was trying to get a handle on how many physical copies, the Star Report sold, because it was this massive bestseller. And so I wrote it sold, I forget what number, at Borders. And my editor said, you have to actually drop a parenthetical explaining that Borders was a major national bookstore. I said, oh,
I was about to say, R.I.P. Borders. I know.
I know. That made me sad. That made me feel old. These reports that now come out at the end, the Mueller report, the Hur report, the whatever, they're all now these 300-page encyclopedias. And I really went back and forth on this, because some of the people I talked to said the entire report writing requirement is ridiculous, it's counterproductive, it's damaging, and it is, in fact, the opposite of what prosecutors normally would do.
Right.
You do your talking in court through your indictments, you don't write a book about it, or a narrative report about it. Others, though, sort of phrased it to me, I'm condensing here, but would the public really accept just silence? Like, let's say the Mueller case. What if Robert Mueller just at the end said, I'm not indicting Donald Trump, period? People would have flipped out. People wouldn't have accepted that. What'd you find? What's your rationale?
Right.
Would people have accepted that, at the end of any of these cases? So I do think there needs to be some reporting requirement. I do also think, however, that it has gotten out of control. It has gotten too extensive. I mean, a famous example of that was Robert Hur, who investigated Joe Biden on the classified documents and dropped a note, has a sentence in there saying he's an elderly man with a faulty memory. This is before Biden dropped out, but when that issue was really heating up, and people flipped out and said he was trying to harm Biden politically. And I don't actually believe that's the case. I mean, he goes out of his way in his report to say that what Donald Trump did with his documents is substantially worse than what Joe Biden did. So I don't know how you can argue he's trying to hurt Joe Biden if he has a whole section in there about why Trump is worse. But I think these reports can be much more summary in fashion. And I think that would, if I was ever in the shoes of having to do one of these reports, rather than 300 pages, I would be thinking 25 pages or something like that. Just get to the key points. Doesn't have to be every single detail.
Yeah, just sort of perhaps to sort of summarize the findings, provide an overview of the rationale as opposed to every comment. Even though, as you note, Robert Hur, speaking about Joe Biden, was actually perhaps part of the mens rea in terms of the crime. So even though it caused a bit of a political firestorm.
Yep.
So now that the book has been out, I guess it's been published 6 months ago, and you finalized it, I'm sure, well before then. Any further thoughts about how to future-proof the institution, given the current congressional climate, the composition of the court, the now hollowing out of DOJ?
Yeah. I think the pitch that I make at the end of the book, and you alluded to this, has become even more, I guess you could say, resonant or even more desperate, which is whenever the next president comes in, the 48th president, he or she will find that a lot of guardrails have been kicked down. And I don't just mean this one. I mean ethics restrictions. I mean restrictions on personal private profiteering. I mean the way the pardon power has been used. I mean firing independent agency heads and getting rid of inspectors general. You're familiar with the list, I'm sure. But the complete and utter destruction of DOJ's independence and the utter impossibility of having anything like a special counsel under the Trump administration is something that's too important, and that the next president, I know it's going to be tempting, right? If I was the 48th president, I go, who really likes ethics restrictions? Who really it would be kind of easier for me if there was no inspectors general. I don't need these limits. I don't want some Ken Starr or Jack Smith poking around my business, right? But this is too important. This is too important to what we do. This is too important to any perception of accountability for the most powerful people in this country. And if you just let the whole notion of a special counsel die and abandon any hope of going after these cases, you're asking for trouble. And the example I use, by the way, the counterexample in the book is Jim Comey and what he did before the 2016 election. They could, I'll spare the details, but they should have appointed special counsel. They could have appointed special counsel. Instead, Loretta Lynch just completely abdicated, said, I'm going to do whatever the FBI says to do. She said that. And then Jim Comey, we know the infamous history of he just makes this thing up as he goes along, and he makes 2 announcements within a few weeks of the election that were completely inappropriate. And later he was blasted by DOJ's Inspector General for doing. So I think if we go to if we adopt a scenario where there's no rules and we're just going to ad-lib all these, we're asking for trouble. And I also think the book is a pitch for the return of some form of independence to DOJ. I mean, just a week or two ago, there is now a literal banner of Donald Trump draped over the Justice Department building. That violates everything that DOJ stands for. To have an image of the president, a big gaudy image of the president draped atop the building. If I had to publish this book again and watch for this, because I'm sure the next wave of books that come out, that will be the cover image.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to ask because since the through line that you identified of your 3 books is DOJ's independence, and that's now very much, at risk. It's been decimated at this point.
It's dead.
Do you have your next book project in the works already?
Well, the natural one would be to what the heck happened under, Pam Bondi and Donald Trump. I do know that lane is already taken by a couple of other people. So I'm going to let them do their things. I need a breather anyway. I don't exactly, the ideal, the book I want to write is about some sort of really important event from history that becomes resonant again for a new reason. I think we have some of that in here, but I'll give you an example. I don't think it's enough. It's not enough for a book. But I did a piece for CNN the other couple weeks ago that we ran a bunch of times where I interviewed a woman named Melba Beals, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, one of the 9 high school at the time. Now she's 84, but back then she was 15. Black high school students who integrated Little Rock Central High School. So, and the history of it is Brown versus Board of Education, of course, happens in 1954. Some of the southern states and cities resisted, overtly resisted. Arkansas, the governor deployed the National Guard to block Melba and her classmates. The Ku Klux Klan intimidated them. And Dwight D. Eisenhower had to invoke the Insurrection Act, which Donald Trump is fond of threatening. But this is why we have to have an Insurrection Act, right? Because it was necessary to enforce the Supreme Court's will and to get Melba and her classmates into the building and to enforce desegregation. So that kind of thing, I think if you could take an important piece of our history that's maybe somewhat buried or forgotten, but becomes newly relevant and explaining why it's newly relevant, I would love to do something like that next. I don't have it yet. Don't start a book until you have the topic, folks.
Yeah.
Trust me.
We won't do that. So let me wrap up with what are sort of our standard three questions about writing.
Okay.
Whose writing do you admire? This can be any genre: fiction, nonfiction, journalism.
Oh, that's so good. There's okay. I'm gonna cheat a little and give you a couple. I love not historical nonfiction told in a fun, interesting, engaging way. There was a guy who passed away young named Tony Horowitz, who wrote some great books about Captain Cook's journey and the Civil War that were very accessible. I love that sort of accessible, fun, interesting history. Hampton Sides is great at that too. It's not quite as fun and funny, but it's great. I also love these writers who can, and the one who comes to my mind is Susan Orlean, who can take you inside a very narrow area and you're like, why would I care about that? But they make it beautiful and interesting. I mean, she wrote The Orchid Thief. She wrote a wonderful book about libraries and sort of the majesty of libraries. So I really admire that. But all of them are I read and I go, man, I can't do this. It's like, it's like being a basketball player and watching a better one and go, I'm just going to admire that. I wish I could do that.
I love those suggestions. So, and then my second question is, do you have a writing ritual?
Yes. Here's my one piece of writing time management, in addition to what I said before. I am good at making use of the little brief intermissions. So use the intermission. So my kids, when I was writing, my kids are both in college now, but when I was writing all three of these books were in middle school, high school. And so I would have days where, like, let's say I finished up on CNN at 2:30 and I had to go pick them up at school at 3:15. I was pretty good about writing for 25 of those 45 minutes, grabbing something to eat. But that adds up. If you can make use of those little sort of empty gaps, you have to swear off to the extent possible, like doom scrolling and not spending 22 minutes on Instagram. That's my best trick for sort of time management.
Yeah, it's like the Pomodoro method, or it's sort of like a writing snack. You just have to take advantage of the time that you have, and it does add up.
Exactly.
And last is, who is the teacher who most influenced your writing, and also who taught you legal writing?
Oh, that's great. When it comes to, I had a lot of influential teachers who I thank by name in the acknowledgments of my first book is like a rambling Oscar speech. And my editor, I said to him, how long should this be? And he said, look, here's the truth about the acknowledgments. No one's going to read it other than the people who are hoping they're in there. So just go crazy, like have fun with it. I toned it down a little bit after that. I actually, I love reading. Now I'm like, really, I turn right to acknowledgments when I read a book. But the one that most influenced my writing was a high school English teacher I had. I went to public school all through my life in New Jersey. At Cherry Hill East, I had an English teacher named Matthew Carr, Mr. Carr. And what he taught us was two things. One, you're not necessarily restricted to the 5 paragraphs, and the fifth one is this. But he also said, don't just be reckless, have a reason for what you're doing, but you can break out of the mold. The second thing that Mr. Carr really imprinted on us was the importance of editing. And you and I talked about this earlier, but I remember we did an essay. He said, this is a really important essay. It's worth however many points. It's due Monday. And we brought it in Monday. He said, good. Everyone write down how many words, we had to get a word count on it. This was in the early days of word processing. He said, whatever your word count is right now, you take it home. It's due back Wednesday, but 10% fewer words. Mm-hmm. And we were like, oh God. And then we came back Wednesday and he said, now come back Friday, 10% fewer words again. And that that rigorous, relentless editing is something that he really sort of got through my head in a way that has stayed with me now.
I love that. Just constant distillation. And I think Stephen King even has a quote about first draft minus 10% or something, that you're really trimming bloat or fat or whatever it is off of that. But
well, and it's there's various expressions for this, like you have to drown your kittens is what I've heard. But sometimes you'll write something and you go, oh, that's good, that's snappy, but it doesn't really fit or requires a detour or it's a little windy, and I don't think I've ever thought to myself, boy, I wish there's that thing I cut that I wish was in there. I've had the opposite. I'm sure in all 3 books where I said, I probably could have cut that. You know what I mean? So you have to just sort of relentlessly take the scalpel out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I tell my students, spending more time pre-writing and rewriting as opposed to, drafting as you talked about in your process. Sometimes just get it out there and then shape it afterwards.
Oh, and who taught me legal writing? I don't remember exactly who taught me, but my key recommendation for legal writing is the same. You said this earlier, which is you don't have to be like exhaustively and exhaustingly correct about everything. You know who's wonderful writers? I mean, the Supreme Court justices right now, some of them, Elena Kagan. I mean, the way she writes is so vivid and so accessible. Ketanji Brown Jackson, same thing. Amy Coney Barrett to an extent. It's just. Yeah, it's dense in legalese because it has to be, but if you read the opening few paragraphs, it's so sharp and it's so almost conversational. I really admire the way they write.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great to hear, and that's something that we should all strive for, and you've achieved it in your book. Again, I'll hold it up since we're coming to the end. When You Come at the King, highly recommend. Thank you, Elie.
Thank you
for being here.
Thanks so much. This was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.